My husband filed for divorce while I was battling a deadly disease, thinking I was just a useless wife. But he had no idea I was the millionaire CEO behind the empire he built, and I made him pay dearly. My name is Arya. I'm 42 years old, and I live in the suburbs of Seattle with my husband, Ethan. On paper, I'm a full-time housewife. What few people know is that behind that quiet facade, I'm the CEO of a biotech distribution company that brings in millions of dollars in revenue each year. My salary is around $145. Zero a year. But Ethan has never had a clue. We met at a friend's gathering when I had just turned 30. Back then, Ethan was a warm, attentive man with a charming way of speaking. He noticed every little detail, like how I held my coffee cup with my left hand, or the way my eyes lit up when my favorite song was mentioned. I used to think if I could spend my life with someone like that, it would be the greatest blessing. We got married after nearly a year of dating. At first, I truly believed I had chosen the right person. But that seemingly lasting happiness began to fade when Ethan started showing his true self. He began making excuses not to change jobs. Even though his current salary barely covered basic expenses, when I gently offered suggestions, he brushed them off, sometimes even saying, "Don't try to make me live by your standards. I'm not your employee." I tried to talk him into it many times, even when my company had an opening in the administrative department, a role that only required basic communication skills and a professional attitude. The salary was more than double what Ethan was making. I even personally spoke to the head of HR to hold the position for him. But when I brought it up, Ethan frowned and said, "You think I'm so useless. I need my wife to get me a job. Don't meddle in my business." I was stunned. I couldn't understand how someone who once said he loved me so deeply could now take sincere advice as an insult. His stubbornness baffled me. But even after being shut down, I kept trying to endure. I thought, as long as I made enough money to keep life stable, everything would work out. Every month, I regularly deposited $1.400 into Ethan's account as a living allowance. He would burn through it in less than 2 weeks. Then text me complaints about food prices, gas prices, how life was stressful. I stayed silent, not because I didn't know he was spending the money on frivolous things like sneaker collections or online games, but because I was too exhausted to argue with my income. That amount wasn't significant. But what hurt me wasn't the money. It was his growing indifference. He never once asked if I was tired after a long day. Never noticed when I stayed up late, answering emails or had to fly to 2 different cities in 1 week. In Ethan's eyes, I was just a woman living off the money he provided. And he was the one working hard to keep this home together. I remember one time my mother came over to help tidy the house while I was in online meetings all morning. As soon as Ethan got home, he tossed his keys on the table and said something that made my mother freeze. "Another stranger in the house again. I need my peace and quiet." I stood up, took a deep breath, and spoke through clenched anger. "She's not a stranger. She came here to help us. Not to be disrespected like that." Ethan just shrugged. "That's how you see it. But not me. I have a right to feel uncomfortable in my own house." I turned away, hiding the tears that had started to fall. That was the first time I felt a crack in our marriage that couldn't be repaired. After that day, there was a strange silence between us. We still lived under the same roof, shared dinner, sometimes watched the same television show, but everything felt cold and forced. No more random hugs, no more goodnight wishes. Just 2 people living side by side. As if the bond between us had dried up and turned into routine, Ethan became increasingly irritable. He'd get mad over little things like a towel not folded the way he liked, or the television remote not in the right spot. He blamed me when the coffee machine broke. Even though he was the last one who used it, it was like I had become the scapegoat for every little frustration in his life. I started to feel like a maid in my own home. One evening, I came back from a tense meeting. I hadn't even taken off my shoes yet, when Ethan stood in the kitchen holding up a shirt and snapped. "This shirt isn't even ironed. Do you ever do anything right? I gave a hollow laugh, swallowing my anger. I used to be the woman running around pitching to major clients, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. Now, I was being asked if I knew how to use an iron. I said nothing. The more I talked, the more he twisted my words, blamed me, and tore into everything I tried so hard to preserve. I was starting to feel drained. My body was okay, but my spirit was worn thin. I remember once when I had the flu, running a high fever, and unable to get out of bed. Ethan didn't even check on me. Instead of bringing me medicine or asking how I felt, he just stood at the door and said, "Hurry up and get better. I don't have time to take care of you." I didn't expect much, but those words sent a chill down my spine. That wasn't something a husband should say to his wife. That was something a stranger would say when forced to live with someone they didn't like. The loneliness became more and more overwhelming. I felt lost in my own life. When did the man who once held my hand at our wedding, promising to walk through life with me, to become the one who hurt me the most? At that point, I started having restless nights, often waking up in the middle of the night wondering why I was still here. Why was I, a strong, successful woman who had overcome so many obstacles, putting up with such a damaging relationship I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother, Clara, who had always loved and protected me like I was her greatest treasure? She called many times to check in, but I always said everything was fine. I didn't want her to worry, didn't want anyone to see my weakness, but I never expected Ethan to drag my mother into this in the worst way. One Saturday afternoon, my mother came over. She brought my favorite stew and a basket of fresh fruit. I was chatting with her when Ethan walked in. He took one look and sighed loudly, dropped his bag, and muttered, "Again, there's always someone sitting around this house." My mother was startled but kept her smile. She tried to stay polite. "I'm just dropping by to see my daughter for a bit. I'm not intruding." Ethan shrugged, opened the fridge to grab a drink, and spoke like I wasn't even there. "I don't want to have dinner with outsiders. Some people just don't know how to respect boundaries." I stood frozen. In that moment, I saw my mother hesitate. She gently set her bowl down, glanced at me, and softly said, "I think I should go. I'll come by another time." I walked her to the door, heart sinking. When the door shut behind her, I turned to Ethan, my voice no longer holding back. "Do you realize how hurtful you're being?" He looked at me unfazed. "I'm just being honest. If you can't handle that, that's your problem." I stood still in the quiet kitchen for a long time. The house no longer felt warm. Everything I had built now felt like it was falling apart piece by piece. At that moment, I had no idea that just a few weeks later, something major would happen and change everything. And in my most vulnerable moment, Ethan would show his true colors more clearly than ever. I don't remember exactly when I collapsed, only that the office lights dimmed and everything faded to black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a hospital bed in the emergency wing of Swedish Medical Center, an IV in my arm, and my head heavy, like I had just gone through a storm. The doctor said I had fainted due to prolonged exhaustion and needed further tests because some of my readings were unusual. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had always been strong, used to a fast-paced life, and figured I'd be fine after a few days of rest. But 2 days later, I was brought into a private room to hear the diagnosis. "We found a tumor in your pancreas," the doctor said, looking straight at me. "Fortunately, we caught it early, but you'll need to start treatment immediately. This won't be easy." I heard his voice, but everything else sounded muffled. The ground beneath me felt like it was slipping away. I wasn't afraid of the illness. I was afraid of facing it alone. That night, I texted Ethan briefly saying I was in the hospital and needed to talk. He didn't reply. I called. His phone rang, then went to voicemail. Not a single message, not a word of concern. I began treatment without him by my side. The infusions drained my body. My taste buds faded and my hair started falling out. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a different woman, frail, pale, but with eyes still burning with life. I kept fighting, not just for myself, but because I knew there was still something I hadn't let go of. I couldn't let Ethan walk out of my life that easily. He didn't deserve that. For 2 weeks, I fought alone in the hospital without a single family member in sight. I lied to my mother, telling her I was on a business trip so she wouldn't worry. But then, on a Thursday afternoon, Ethan showed up. I thought I was dreaming. He stood at the hospital room door, hands in his pockets, eyes cold. "You're here?" I said softly, my voice from exhaustion. He didn't respond right away. He walked in, placed a folder on the bedside table, and spoke like he was negotiating a contract. "I've filed for divorce. The house and the car will be in my name. I think that's fair. As for you, I'm not even sure how long you'll be around." I stared at him, stunned. Something inside me shattered into pieces. Not because he was abandoning me. I'd already expected that. But because of the sheer coldness in every word, he didn't come to check on me. He came to claim what he thought he was entitled to. As if I was someone whose value was about to run out, I pressed my lips together, hiding every emotion. I didn't want him to see me weak. I nodded and said quietly, "Pick whatever you want. Thank you for coming." Ethan paused, maybe surprised by how easily I agreed. He shrugged, turned away, and said one last thing. "Not like you have a choice anyway." When the door clicked shut behind him, I didn't cry. Instead, a cold smile tugged at my lips. I whispered to myself, "You just woke up the real me, Ethan, and soon you'll realize you made the biggest mistake of your life." I picked up the bedside phone and called the one person at my company I trusted, Marcus, my chief financial officer. He had always been loyal, discreet, and the one who knew best just how much power I truly held. "Marcus, I need your help with something," I said, my voice unusually calm. He was quiet for a moment, then answered, "I've been waiting for this call. Just say the word." I nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see me. I lay still in that white hospital room, watching the soft sunlight filter through the curtains, strangely at peace. Maybe because I had finally decided to let Ethan go, but not the way he thought. He wanted to discard me at my weakest. Fine. But in that moment, I realized I wasn't the one who needed to be set free. It was him from the life I'd carried on my back. A life he never even knew I built. 3 days after that cold hospital visit, Marcus came to see me. No flowers. No sweets. Just a leather briefcase containing everything I needed. He set it on the table and asked gently, "Are you sure you want to go through with this plan?" I looked straight at him, my gaze unwavering. "Yes, and I want everything to start tomorrow." Marcus understood. He was the only one in the company who knew I had used my mother's name as the legal representative to keep my identity hidden. I'd always wanted to live modestly, never letting Ethan know I was the one behind the major contracts his company depended on. Looking back, maybe I had been too kind. The next morning, I signed a short letter terminating the supply agreement between my company and Cortec, where Ethan worked in logistics. That contract made up over 60% of Cortec's revenue last quarter, and I was the one who had approved it after a pitch led by Ethan nearly a year ago. I remembered clearly how excited he was, boasting that it was thanks to him that the company had secured a deal with a major partner without ever realizing that major partner was sitting just one bedroom wall away. The termination letter was sent out at 8:00 a.m. Monday. By 3 p.m., I received a call from the CEO of Cortec, Mr. Larson. He kept it brief. "We're quite surprised. If possible, we'd like to know the reason." I replied, calm but firm. "I've been made aware that one of your employees has demonstrated inappropriate behavior, disrespect toward female colleagues, and signs of misusing company assets. As a major partner, I cannot condone that." There was a pause before he asked, "What's the name of that employee?" I answered simply, "Ethan Reed." That afternoon, Ethan came home late, looking pale. He had no idea I had hired a private lawyer to send him a counter-divorce filing, this time with a clause requiring him to vacate the house, which was under my name, within 30 days. That house, by the way, I bought. I only added his name to appease my prideful husband. Ethan opened the fridge to get some water without saying a word. Then, after a few moments of silence, he finally said softly, "I got laid off." I set my book down, not the least bit surprised. Because of the terminated contract with my company, he turned to look at me, eyes full of disbelief. "How do you know?" I walked slowly to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out an envelope. I placed it on the table and said, my voice calm to the point of being unnerving, "Because I'm the one who ended that contract. I'm the CEO of Nexus Bio. Ethan, the company you proudly claim to have won over. The company you thought you were smart enough to convince." Ethan froze. He looked at me like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. I continued, "For all these years, I've paid every bill, covered your credit card debt, paid tuition for your nephew when your cousin hit hard times. I transferred over $1, $500 a month to you, in allowance. When your actual salary didn't even come close to that, I did it all because I believed in something called love." Ethan stepped back. He grabbed the envelope from the table, opened it with trembling hands, then looked up. "This can't be real." I smiled. "Divorce papers? Asset division terms. And your meeting schedule with my lawyer. You have 30 days to move out. And the $3, $200 monthly mortgage payment. I won't be covering that anymore." He was stunned. The air thickened around us, filled only by the heavy breathing of the man who once leaned on me like the whole world belonged to him. I walked away, leaving him there with numbers and a brutal reality crashing down. In my heart, there was no hatred, just clarity. Ethan had lived too long in the shadow I created. Now it was time for him to step out and face what he had taken for granted. Just 3 days after Ethan received the official divorce papers from my lawyer, the hospital room. Phone rang near midnight. I was exhausted from my second round of chemo, but when I saw his name on the screen, I knew right away the panic had begun. "Aria, please, just hear me out." His voice was shaky, rough, like he'd been crying. I said nothing. On the other end was a man in freefall, and I, the one he had once left behind, was now the only lifeline he was desperately clinging to. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I was stupid. I thought you were just some dependent woman, but now I know. You were the one holding everything together. You were the reason my life didn't fall apart. I put the phone on speaker, leaned back against my pillow, and closed my eyes. Not because I was moved, but because I wanted to hear every desperate word, something I had once wished for. Back when I lay in a hospital bed, battling illness alone, Ethan kept going, his voice rising with urgency. "I've lost everything. The house is about to be foreclosed because I can't make the payments. The company, they didn't just fire me. They put a formal warning in my file. No one else will hire me now. Aria, please give me another chance." I opened my eyes, watching the soft glow of the nightlight, calm and cold. I spoke. "A chance. You had a whole decade to respect me, to love, to share, to understand, and you chose not to. Now that everything you were used to is gone, now you realize my worth. Too late. Ethan, I know you're angry, but we were happy once. Please remember those times. I'm begging you." I smiled faintly. "Ethan, do you remember the name Sophia?" The other end of the line suddenly went silent. I could hear his breath catch. "How? How did you find out about that?" I spoke each word sharp as a blade. The CEO of Cortec called to apologize and happened to mention they'd quietly investigated an internal complaint. Turns out, you had a personal relationship with the new intern, Sophia Bennett, 24 years old, daughter of the Portland branch director. Should I go into detail about those late overtime nights? Ethan started stammering. "No, it's not what you think. It wasn't like that. You're right. It was worse than I thought. I hung up. Not another word. Right after, I opened my contacts. Hit block. I also emailed my lawyer requesting a no-contact clause during the divorce proceedings and began preparing a civil suit for breach of marital duty. In the state of Washington, with proof of infidelity, the betrayed spouse can file for emotional damages. And I had plenty. The next morning, Lavier, Nora Bennett, came to the hospital. She showed me a stack of screenshots from conversations between Ethan and Sophia, flirtatious messages, hotel, meetups, even selfies taken in the Cortec office, all time-stamped and geotagged. I wasn't shocked. I just felt relieved. Every suspicion I'd pushed aside now had a name. I've sent a formal demand for $85. Nil in damages. Nora said he'll likely contest it. But with this evidence, the court will be on your side. I nodded. Not because I needed the money, but because I needed my dignity placed where it belonged. A week later, I was discharged temporarily for at-home monitoring. During that time, Ethan tried to contact me through emails, social media, even showed up at my company's office. Not knowing security had already been instructed not to let him anywhere near. Every attempt to win me back only confirmed one thing. Ethan didn't love me. He just didn't know how to live without me. I started rewriting my financial plans. This time with no more husband's living expenses category. I also approved Marcus to hand over the COO role to a new hire, so I could step back, slow down, and finally enjoy some peace. And when I stood on the balcony of my new home, the one I moved into after leaving the old house full of memories and pain, I closed my eyes and felt the cool breeze brushing through the short new hair that had begun to grow after treatment. I didn't need a man to feel worthy. I just needed myself. Strong, clear-headed, and never again letting anyone else define my life. Rumors of Ethan's downfall spread like wildfire in the local business community. Cortec cut the contract, and his termination file was quietly circulated to partner companies and industry contacts. Soon enough, Ethan became the name everyone wanted to avoid. A logistics employee caught in a scandal and facing legal consequences for breach of marital duty. With no home to return to, Ethan moved in temporarily with an old friend in a cheap apartment complex in Tacoma. A few weeks later, I heard he sold the car he once proudly called his symbol of freedom. Part of the money went toward paying off credit card debt, in the same cards he had used so freely to buy gaming gear and lavish meals. No one wanted to hire someone with a stain on their record and no practical skills. Eventually, he had to accept a job on the night shift at a delivery center, where the meager paycheck wasn't enough to cover monthly bills. Calls from collection agencies started piling up. His small apartment echoed with the sound of late-night phone rings. Not from loved ones, but from places chasing unpaid debts. As for Sophia, the young woman who once laughed with Ethan after hours, she vanished from social media just days after the scandal broke. I didn't know what happened to her until Nora, Lavier, told me her family had agreed to settle part of the damages privately to avoid public litigation. Word had it, her parents took her back to their farm in Oregon and cut all ties with her former life. For them, that was the only way to salvage the family's reputation. As for me, my final treatment ended on a crisp autumn morning, when the doctor looked at me and said, "Your test results show you're completely clear." I didn't say a word. I just smiled and gently squeezed his hand. It was the moment I felt reborn. I returned to work after 2 months of rest. But this time, I wasn't the same Arya who tried to balance career and marriage. Now, I was Arya on my own terms, focused, calm, and no longer weighed down by anyone who couldn't see my worth. The company welcomed me back with a simple but heartfelt team meeting. Everyone stood and clapped when I entered the main conference room. Marcus smiled and handed me a mug that read, "Welcome back, boss." I had once doubted whether I could start over, but in that moment, I knew not only had I come back, I'd come back stronger than ever. In the months that followed, I received more than a few date invitations, some from business partners, A few from old friends who had followed my story online, but I turned them all down. Not because I'd closed my heart forever, but because I knew I still needed time to heal, to enjoy a life no longer bound by responsibility to someone unworthy. I bought a small lakeside house in Bellingham where I could watch the sunrise each morning and listen to birdsong each evening. It wasn't grand, not as luxurious as the old house, but it was my space. Peaceful. A hole. And no one entered unless invited. One weekend afternoon, while I was brewing tea in the kitchen, Marcus stopped by. We sat on the porch watching the lake shimmer under the golden sunset. "Have you thought about getting married again?" he asked, half teasing. I looked at him and smiled softly. "Not right now. Maybe someday. But for now, I'm happy like this." He nodded, saying nothing more. The breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't just overcome Ethan or the illness. I had overcome the fear that once kept me silent too long. I took a sip of hot tea, thinking quietly to myself. In the end, I became the one who wrote the final chapter of my story. Through my journey of pain and triumph, I realized that your self-worth is not in what others think of you, but in how you rise from the pain I used to silently sacrifice, putting the happiness of others above my own. But now, I understand that self-respect is a fire that should never be allowed to go out. Live for yourself, because only you can define your story. From my own journey, I've learned that resilience doesn't come from moments of strength, but from the times we rise after being pushed to our lowest. I once gave my heart to someone unworthy, once sacrificed in silence without recognition, but now I live for myself, no longer trying to please anyone. True happiness began the moment I chose to put my self-respect above everything else. My story ends here, but I want to hear from you. What do you think of my decision? What would you do if you were in a similar situation? Leave a comment below. Share your story. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories.
Madison Long stood by the window of her small Boston apartment, the morning sunlight spilling through the glass in soft golden waves. At 34, her eyes carried the weight of years, lines of exhaustion etched beneath them, but a quiet softness lingered in her features. She sipped her coffee, the bitter warmth grounding her as the faint hum of traffic drifted up from the suburbs below. The walls around her were thin, the furniture worn, yet the space felt like hers, a fragile sanctuary carved out for her and her son. "Mom, I can't tie my tie." Ethan's voice broke the stillness, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see her 9-year-old son in the living room, his navy tie draped awkwardly around his neck. His dark hair stuck out in stubborn tufts, and his fingers fumbled with the fabric, a mix of frustration and determination on his young face. Madison set her mug on the counter, a gentle smile tugging at her lips, and crossed the room to kneel before him. "Yes, it's tricky, but don't worry. Mom will help you," she said, her voice steady, soothing. Her hands moved with practiced ease, looping the tie into a neat knot, but her chest tightened as she worked. Today wasn't just any day. It was Rachel's wedding, her sister-in-law's lavish affair at a luxury hotel, a place Madison least wanted to be, with its glittering chandeliers and judging eyes. She'd spent the night tossing, dreading the hours ahead, but Ethan's small, hopeful face had settled her choice. "There," she said, smoothing his collar. "Today is a special day, Ethan. Your aunt's wedding. We need to be extra polite." He tilted his head, studying her with those sharp, perceptive eyes that saw too much for his age. She felt the question he didn't ask, the weight of a world she couldn't shield him from entirely. The sunlight caught her reflection in his gaze. Tired, resolute, a mother clinging to dignity, and she wondered how much he already understood. For now, she held his trust, a fragile thread she'd fight to keep. Today, she'd face the storm for him, her pride tucked quietly beneath her simple gray dress. The Maple Diner sat on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering like a tired heartbeat against the gray dusk. For over 10 years, Madison Long had walked its linoleum floors, her sneakers squeaking faintly as she balanced trays of coffee and plates of greasy fries. The air smelled of burnt toast and stale cigarette smoke, the counters scarred from years of careless elbows. She moved with a rhythm born of habit, smile, nod, refill, her apron pockets jingling with meager tips. Long hours stretched from dawn to midnight, her body aching, but she never complained. Complaint was a luxury she couldn't afford. 4 years ago, her world had collapsed in a single, quiet moment. Daniel Hayes, her husband of nearly a decade, had come home late, his tie loosened, his eyes avoiding hers. He'd climbed the corporate ladder swiftly, a sales executive with a corner office and a swagger she'd once loved. "I want a divorce," he'd said, his voice flat, cutting. He'd been sleeping with his assistant, a bright-eyed 20-something who matched his new life. Polished, ambitious, nothing like the waitress he'd left behind. Madison, with her calloused hands and faded dreams, no longer fit his assent. She'd nodded, dry-eyed, signed the papers on their chipped kitchen table, and packed a single suitcase. With Ethan, then 5, clutching her hand, she'd returned to her parents' modest home, a sagging house on a street of cracked sidewalks. The divorce left her with little. No savings, no apologies, just a son who watched her with wide, trusting eyes. That was her pride, Ethan. The reason she rose at dawn each day. The reason she endured the diner's fickle regulars and their half-hearted tips. She'd once dreamed of more, a nutrition degree, a life beyond the apron. But those ambitions had withered under the weight of survival. Now, at 34, she carried the scars of betrayal beneath her calm exterior. Daniel thrived, his suits sharper, his world glossier, while she remained the woman he'd discarded. Just a waitress, he'd called her, the words a blade she still felt. Yet, in the diner's dim light, she found a strange strength. Each shift was a quiet defiance, a refusal to break. She'd built a life for Ethan, lunches packed, stories read at night, piecing together a fragile stability from the wreckage. The wedding loomed like a shadow, a reminder of the family that had scorned her, but she'd face it. For Ethan, she'd walk into that gilded storm, her head high, her heart steeled by the love she'd never let Daniel take. Madison smoothed the fabric of her simple gray dress, standing before the cracked mirror in their apartment. The hem was modest, the color muted. She'd chosen it to blend in, to dodge the stares she knew awaited her. At 34, her beauty was understated, a quiet glow that needed no embellishment, though she rarely saw it herself. The clock ticked toward departure, each second a pulse of dread. Ethan shuffled nearby, his suit slightly too big, the navy tie she'd knotted hanging neatly against his chest. "Grandma Evelyn and Aunt Rachel don't like you, do they, Mom?" His voice was soft, but the question landed like a stone. 9 years old, and already he saw the cracks in their world. Madison turned, meeting his steady gaze, those sharp eyes that missed nothing. She knelt, leveling with him, her hands resting lightly on his arms. "Adult relationships are complicated, Ethan," she said, her tone gentle, honest. "They're from a different world than us, but family ties don't change." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, Rachel's sneers and Evelyn's coldness flashing in her mind. The wedding invitation sat on the counter, thick paper, silver script, a taunt disguised as courtesy. She'd planned to decline, to spare herself the ordeal, until Ethan's quiet plea shifted her resolve. "I want to see Dad," he'd said, his voice small but firm. For him, she'd go, stepping into a place where she'd be a stranger, among wealth and scorn. She rose, brushing a hand over his hair. "Let's get ready," she said, forcing a smile. Before they left, she placed her hands on his shoulders, her touch steadying them both. No matter what happens, we are family, Ethan. Never forget that. He nodded, his face serious, a flicker of determination in his eyes that mirrored her own. The taxi waited outside, its engine rumbling, ready to carry them into the storm. Madison took a deep breath, her pride a quiet armor, and led her son toward an uncertain day. The taxi rattled to a stop before the Grand Harbor View Hotel, its sleek facade towering over the Boston street like a monument to wealth. Madison Long stepped out, her gray dress catching the late morning breeze, and helped Ethan from the back seat. At 34, she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, a quiet ache beneath her calm exterior. Ethan, 9 and wide-eyed, gripped her hand as they hesitated at the base of the marble staircase. Above them, massive chandeliers gleamed through the lobby windows, casting a golden glow that seemed to mock their modest arrival. She squared her shoulders, her pride a thin shield, and led him upward. Inside, the air buzzed with opulence, crystal clinking, laughter echoing off polished walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a stunning view of Boston Bay, the water shimmering like a promise she'd never touch. At the reception desk, a staff member in crisp black eyed them, her gaze flickering between Madison's simple attire and the guest list. "Mrs. Long?" she asked, her tone uncertain. Madison nodded, forcing a polite smile, but the woman's brow furrowed. She summoned another staff member, their whispers sharp against the hum of the crowd. Madison's grip tightened on Ethan's hand, anxiety prickling her skin. She scanned the room, women in silk, men in tailored suits, champagne flutes glinting, and felt the sting of her own invisibility. "I'll show you to your seats," the staff member finally said, her smile tight, almost apologetic. They followed her through the throng, Ethan's small steps steady beside her. The hall opened before them, vast and elegant, its tables draped in white linen. But as they neared their assigned spots, Ethan stopped short, his voice a hushed jolt. "Mom, what's this?" Madison followed his gaze to the place cards. "Single mother waitress," stared back at her in crisp black ink, while his read, "Single mother's child." The blood drained from her face, humiliation surging like a tide, but she swallowed it down. "It's okay, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort. "Just a bad joke." She flipped the cards over with a quick, deliberate motion, her fingers steadying as she guided him into his seat. Around them, the room pulsed with wealth, a world she didn't belong to. Yet, she sat tall, her dignity a quiet rebellion. For Ethan, she'd endure this, her heart bruised but unbroken, the day's storm only beginning to gather. The grand hall hushed as the pipe organ's solemn notes rolled through the air, a deep resonance that vibrated against the gilded walls. Madison Long sat beside Ethan, her gray dress a muted contrast to the sea of glamour around her. At 34, she felt the weight of eyes. Some curious, some dismissive. But she kept her gaze forward, her hands folded in her lap. Evelyn Hayes swept into view at the entrance, her deep blue dress shimmering with diamond accents, her posture rigid with authority. "Oh, Madison, you came," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and faint disdain, her glance sliding past Ethan as if he were an afterthought. She moved on, greeting others with warmer smiles, leaving a chill in her wake. Then Daniel appeared, striding down the aisle as groomsman, his suit sharp and his stride confident. 4 years had polished him further, his success a tangible aura that tightened Madison's chest. She hadn't seen him since the divorce, and now his presence stirred a tangle of memory and pain. Ethan shifted beside her, his 9-year-old eyes tracking his father, and she forced a smile, her fingers brushing his hand. The music swelled, and Rachel entered, escorted by her father, her wedding gown a cascade of white that drew sighs from the crowd. She was 32, radiant, her smile a portrait of triumph. Madison watched, her heart a quiet storm, but she held steady for her son. The ceremony unfolded with practiced grace. Vows exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, the kiss sealing the union of Rachel and Lucas. The hall applauded, a wave of sound that pressed against Madison's resolve. She maintained her smile, though her thoughts churned. Daniel stood near the altar, his gaze flickering toward them once, brief and unreadable, before turning away. "Dad is looking at us," Ethan whispered, his voice soft but certain. She nodded, her throat tight, unable to predict what that glance meant. Around her, the guests glowed with celebration, their wealth a glittering frame to her exclusion. Yet, in Ethan's small, warm presence, she found an anchor. The ceremony ended, the newlyweds beaming, and Madison exhaled, her complex feelings buried beneath a calm facade. The day wasn't over, and she sensed the tension building, a shadow she couldn't yet name. The reception hall shimmered with life, the clink of champagne glasses and the murmur of laughter filling the air as the lavish dinner loomed. Madison Long sat at their table, her gray dress a quiet island amid the swirl of silk and tuxedos. At 34, she felt the room's pulse, its opulence a stark reminder of her place, or lack of it. Ethan, 9 and curious, sipped orange juice beside her, his eyes darting over the crowd with a child's keen interest. The place cards she'd flipped over lay face down, their cruel labels hidden. But the sting lingered, a bruise beneath her skin. She smoothed her napkin, her hands steadying her nerves, bracing for what might come. Evelyn Hayes rose from her seat, her deep blue dress catching the light as she took the microphone. The room quieted, heads turning toward her commanding presence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth, eloquent. "Thank you for celebrating my beloved daughter Rachel's wedding." She spoke of the couple's bright future, her words polished until her gaze sharpened, landing on Madison. "We have a special guest today, former family member Madison," she said, her tone dripping with malice. "She normally works as a waitress at a restaurant, so I have a suggestion." A pause, deliberate, theatrical. "Madison, since you're a waitress, why don't you help serve dinner tonight?" The silence cracked, splintering into laughter that rippled through the hall. Rachel smirked from the head table, her 32-year-old face alight with cruel amusement, while Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her, his grin faint, uneasy. Madison froze, her breath catching as humiliation flooded her veins. At 34, she'd borne years of quiet scorn, but this, public, gleeful, cut deeper. Her hands trembled, tears pricking her eyes, but Ethan's small form beside her held her still. She couldn't break. Not here. Not now. The laughter swelled, a chorus of mockery, Evelyn's eyes gleaming coldly as she waved off a protest. "It's not a joke," she added. "She's a professional." Madison's throat tightened, her mind racing for an escape, when a movement beside her jolted her focus. Ethan slid his chair back, the scrape of wood against floor piercing the din. At 9, he stood, his small frame straight, his face a mask of calm beyond his years. The laughter faltered, heads turning as he stepped forward, his navy tie still neat from her morning care. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice low, urgent, but he didn't turn back. He walked toward the stage, each step deliberate, his hands steady at his sides. The room hushed, a collective breath held as he reached the microphone, dwarfed by its stand. Madison's heart pounded, fear and awe warring within her. Evelyn's smile wavered, Rachel's eyes narrowed. But Ethan stood firm, his gaze sweeping the adults before him. He adjusted the microphone with one small hand, the gesture quiet, resolute, and in that moment, Madison saw not just her son, but a force she hadn't known he carried. The storm she'd braced for had arrived, and it wore her child's face, ready to shatter the gilded cruelty around them. Ethan Long stood on the stage, the microphone trembling slightly in his small hand as the grand hall fell into a stunned silence. At 9, his navy tie hung neatly against his chest, a stark contrast to the chaos he was about to unleash. Madison Long watched from her seat, her 34-year-old heart pounding, a mix of dread and awe rooting her in place. The laughter that had mocked her moments ago dissolved, replaced by the weight of hundreds of eyes fixed on her son. He adjusted the microphone stand, his movements calm, deliberate, and spoke, his voice clear despite its youth. "I have a present for the bride." The words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Rachel Hayes, 32 and still radiant in her wedding gown, froze at the head table, her smile vanishing as if she'd seen a ghost. Ethan continued, undeterred. "Please stop making fun of my mom," he said, his tone steady, cutting through the room's tension like a blade. "None of you know her. She wakes up at 5 every morning to make my lunch, checks my homework before school, works all day, then reads me books at night." Madison's breath caught, tears welling as she realized how closely he'd watched her, how deeply he'd understood her silent struggles. "She never stops smiling, no matter how tired she is. So nobody has the right to hurt her." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Ethan wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a smartphone, Daniel's birthday gift from months ago, an irony that struck Madison now. "I overheard Aunt Rachel and my dad talking," he said, his voice unwavering. Rachel stood abruptly, gripping Lucas's arm, her face paling, but Ethan tapped the screen and held the phone to the microphone. First came rustling, then Rachel's voice, cruel and unmistakable. "I want to see Madison's stupid face at the wedding. I'll write single, mother, waitress, and humiliate her in front of everyone. Evelyn's on board too." Then Daniel's, cautious but complicit. "Be careful. What if people find out you're pregnant with my child?" The hall erupted in gasps, a shockwave rolling through the guests. Rachel's hands flew to her face, her gown trembling as she shook her head, but the recording pressed on. "James doesn't know anything yet," she laughed. "I've timed it so he won't know it's ours." Madison covered her mouth, her 34-year-old frame trembling with disbelief. Daniel and Rachel, an affair, a child. Ethan stopped the playback, slipping the phone back into his pocket, and turned to Lucas, the groom, 35 and ashen. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "but I thought you had the right to know the truth." Evelyn lurched forward, her deep blue dress swishing as she tried to reclaim control. "Sweet boy, this is a special day," she said, her voice tight, forced. "I'll buy you ice cream later, so let's leave the adult talk, shall we?" Ethan shook his head, his small gesture silencing her. Daniel rose, his 37-year-old face flushed with panic. "Ethan, that's enough," he called, but the boy ignored him, stepping back from the microphone. The room held its breath, the weight of his words pressing down on every gilded corner. Madison sat frozen, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd borne years of quiet pain, but this, Ethan's courage, his defense, cracked her open. The truth he'd unveiled wasn't just a weapon against Rachel and Daniel. It was a mirror, reflecting her worth through her son's eyes. Around her, the guests whispered, their faces a mix of shock and unease. But Ethan stood tall, his 9-year-old resolve unshaken. The storm had broken, and he'd been its thunder, leaving the hall's false elegance in ruins. The grand hall spiraled into chaos, the echoes of Ethan's recording igniting a firestorm among the guests. Madison Long clutched her chair, her 34-year-old frame steady despite the tears drying on her cheeks. Ethan returned to her side, his small hand slipping into hers, and she squeezed it, her pride swelling amid the tumult. Rachel Hayes, 32, collapsed into sobs at the head table, her wedding gown crumpling as she buried her face in her hands. Lucas Carter, 35, and reeling, stared at her, his face a mask of betrayal, while Daniel Hayes stood, his 37-year-old shoulders slumping under the weight of his confession. "It's true," he said, his voice heavy, breaking the stunned silence. "I've been with Rachel. She's pregnant with my child." The admission shattered the room. Lucas staggered back, his mother rushing to his side as his father, red-faced, roared. "Has our family been deceived?" Guests murmured, some rising, others clutching their champagne flutes like lifelines. Evelyn Hayes recovered her footing, her deep blue dress a stark contrast to her paling face, and stormed forward. "Everyone, this is a misunderstanding," she insisted, her tone shrill. "A child's imagination. Don't ruin this day with nonsense." But Lucas's father cut through, his voice stern. "Let's go, son. This marriage is off." The Carter family began to withdraw, their exit a quiet thunder through the hall. Rachel lunged for Lucas, her makeup streaking as she grabbed his arm. "It's a lie, a child's delusion," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Believe me." He shook her off, his eyes icy. "Daniel admitted it. He's the father, right?" She faltered, her silence damning, and Lucas removed his ring, dropping it before her with a soft clink. "Goodbye, Rachel," he said, his words a final cut, and turned away. Daniel sank beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his face a mix of shame and exhaustion. He glanced at Madison once, his eyes flickering with remorse, but he said nothing, the moment slipping past unspoken. Evelyn whirled on Madison and Ethan, her composure fracturing. "You're just as guilty," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "Exposing family shame like this. What disgrace!" Madison straightened, her gray dress unassuming but her stance firm, years of scorn fueling her reply. "You should know shame, Evelyn," she said, her tone calm, cutting. "Your son and daughter betrayed an innocent man, hid a child, and mocked me to cover it. We only revealed the truth." Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed, her arrogance crumbling into stunned silence. Around them, the chaos swelled, Rachel's sobs, Evelyn's muttered curses, the guests' confused chatter. But Madison felt it fade, a distant roar against the quiet strength of Ethan's hand in hers. "Let's go home," she said softly, rising with her son, her dignity a steady flame. As they moved toward the exit, Lucas appeared, his face pale, his steps unsteady. "Wait, please," he called, stopping them. "Is it really true?" Ethan nodded, his 9-year-old eyes clear. "I'm not lying. The recording's real." Lucas closed his eyes, pain etching his features, then placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Your son's brave," he said to Madison, his voice low. "Thank you for the truth. I was blind." Madison met his gaze, her 34-year-old resilience softening with sympathy. "Time will heal," she said gently. "May we both find new beginnings." With that, she turned, Ethan at her side, and stepped into the evening air, leaving the wreckage behind. The storm had passed, and though the scars remained, their path forward glimmered with quiet hope. Madison Long stepped into the cool evening air outside the Grand Harbor View Hotel, the chaos of the reception fading behind her like a distant echo. She held Ethan's hand tightly, his small fingers warm against her 34-year-old palm, a lifeline grounding her after the storm. The taxi idled at the curb, its yellow paint dull against the hotel's gleaming facade, and she guided her 9-year-old son toward it, her gray dress swaying with each steady step. The sky had deepened to a soft indigo, the city lights flickering alive, and she breathed deeply, the weight of the day lifting, if only slightly. Inside the cab, she pulled Ethan close, his head resting against her shoulder as the driver glanced back. "I'm sorry, but it's a bit far." "Is that okay?" she asked, her voice soft, tentative. The man smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling. "No problem, ma'am. Have a nice evening, both of you." The engine rumbled to life, and the hotel shrank in the rearview mirror, its grandeur swallowed by the night. Madison hugged Ethan tighter, her lips brushing his hair. "You're my hero," she whispered, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He shifted, his voice small against her chest. "Did I do something bad, Mom?" Her breath caught, and she tilted his face up, meeting his earnest gaze. "No," she said firmly, stroking his cheek. "You spoke the truth with courage, Ethan. That's never a bad thing." His eyes searched hers, then softened, a faint nod signaling his trust. Yet, beneath her calm, complex emotions churned shock at Daniel and Rachel's betrayal, the revelation of their child, the sting of years of indifference toward Ethan. She understood now why Daniel had drifted so coldly after the divorce, why he'd barely glanced at their son. The taxi rolled through the darkened streets, and Madison let her thoughts settle. Tonight had changed everything. Their lives upended, yes, but perhaps for the better. "Mom, I'm hungry," Ethan murmured, breaking her reverie. She laughed, a sound light and free, and kissed his forehead. "Yes, we didn't get dinner at that place, did we? Let's grab pizza on the way home, eat in peace." He smiled, nestling closer, and she felt the day's wounds begin to heal, stitched by his presence. As the city blurred past, she rested her head against his, her 34-year-old resilience finding new roots. The future was uncertain. Daniel's family might retaliate. Ethan's bond with his father might shift. But tonight, she chose hope. They were a team, unbreakable, heading toward a quiet beginning she could almost taste. 3 months later, an autumn afternoon bathed the Maple Diner in a golden haze, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. Madison Long straightened her new uniform in the break room, her 34-year-old reflection gazing back from a small mirror. A deputy manager badge gleamed on her chest, a quiet triumph earned through years of loyalty and grit. "Congratulations, Maddie," her colleagues called, pressing bouquets into her hands, their smiles genuine. The diner's owner had seen her strength, her patience, and offered the promotion weeks after the wedding's fallout. "You've earned this," he'd said, and she'd felt her confidence flicker back to life. At home, life had shifted in unexpected ways. Ethan burst through the door after school, his 9-year-old energy lighting the small apartment. "Mom, look," he said, waving a test paper with a bold A+ scrawled in red. She hugged him tightly, her pride a steady flame. Since that day, he'd grown, respected at school as a champion of justice, his small action rippling beyond their walls. The wedding had become the talk of Boston, whispers of Rachel and Daniel's disgrace trailing them like shadows. Rachel, now 32, had fled hundreds of miles away, raising her child alone, a single mother mirroring the life she'd once scorned. Daniel, 37, had stumbled hard, his job lost, his reputation shattered. He'd called Madison repeatedly, his voice pleading through the phone. "Let's try again," he'd said, but she'd cut him off, her tone firm. "We're over, Daniel. I'm walking a new path." Evelyn, 62, had retreated into isolation, her social standing crumbled by her children's scandal. One day, a letter arrived, her shaky handwriting offering an apology. Madison hesitated, then penned a brief reply. "I can let the past go, but that's not forgiveness." She mailed it, the act a quiet release. Evenings now held a new rhythm. Madison pulled on her coat, heading to night classes at the local community college, a scholarship reviving her old dream of a nutrition degree. Ethan stayed with her sister next door, and 3 nights a week, she sat among students, her 34-year-old mind soaking up knowledge. "Mom, can you own a restaurant someday?" he'd asked one night, his eyes bright. She'd smiled, nodding. "Yes, I can. I've just taken the first step." Shame had once clung to her title, single mother, but now it fueled her, a badge of honor she wore with grace. Tonight they'd promised to watch his favorite movie after her class, a ritual binding them closer. "Ready?" she asked, adjusting his scarf. He nodded, his grin wide. "Yes, Mom. We're the strongest team." She stroked his hair, her heart full, reflecting on that fateful wedding. If Ethan hadn't stood up, she might still be lost. Her worth, buried under years of scorn. Life had unfolded in strange, beautiful ways. The day meant to break her had opened a door instead. As they stepped into the crisp evening, Madison felt it. A beginning, not an end. Their story woven with resilience and love, stronger than ever.